The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Corinne Mitchell's kitchen, casting shadow patterns across the granite countertop that her ex-husband had insisted on installing 3 years ago, the last luxury before he'd left her for someone younger. She stared at the eviction notice for the third time that morning, the words blurring together like watercolor. 30 days. That's all the bank was giving her. 30 days to find $47,000. She was 52 years old, worked as a part-time medical transcriber from home, and had exactly $3,000 in her savings account. The house that she and David had poured their lives into for 28 years, was being taken from her because she'd missed 9 months of mortgage payments. The pandemic had crushed her freelance income. Then came the medical emergency with her mother, the hospital bills, the endless spiral. David's lawyer had been brutally efficient about freezing the joint accounts during the divorce. Corinne set down the notice and picked up her coffee, which had gone cold an hour ago. She didn't bother reheating it. Cold coffee matched her mood. Her daughter Maya appeared in the doorway, already dressed for her shift at the grocery store. At 19, Maya still had that bounce in her step, that belief that the world was fundamentally fair and that hard work solved problems. Corinne recognized it as the luxury of not yet having been devastated by life. "Mom, you're doing the thing again," Maya said, nodding toward Corinne's hands, which had unconsciously twisted themselves into knots. "The stress thing." "I'm fine," Corinne said, unclenching her fists, "just thinking about stuff." Maya moved to the fridge, grabbing the yogurt she'd purchased with her own money. Now that Corinne couldn't feed her properly, the girl had taken to buying her own groceries. The thought made Corinne's stomach twist with shame and something sharper: rage. "Hey," Maya said, turning back. "That new client thing you were waiting to hear about." "Didn't get it," Corinne said. "They hired someone in the Philippines, 40 cents an hour." Maya made a face. She sat down across from her mother, abandoning her yogurt, and reached for Corinne's hands. Her daughter's grip was warm and firm. "We're going to be okay, Mom. I'll pick up more shifts. I can." "No," Corinne pulled her hands back, not unkindly. "No, sweetie, you're going to graduate. You're going to college. I didn't work myself into the ground for 2 decades so you could drop out and stock shelves. But if we need, we'll figure it out." The words hung in the space between them, heavy with the weight of a promise Corinne had no idea how to keep. After Maya left for work, Corinne moved to her home office, a converted bedroom with a desk, 2 monitors, and a filing cabinet overflowing with documents representing years of financial hope and recent years of financial catastrophe. She'd tried everything: 3 job applications a day, credit counseling, which essentially meant someone had told her to stop eating so much, a GoFundMe page that had raised exactly $412 before the algorithm buried it under thousands of more successful sob stories. She pulled up an email from her bank. It was the 3rd notice in a week. The language was corporate cold. "We understand this is a difficult time. However, we must inform you that without payment by December 15th, we will proceed with foreclosure proceedings." Corinne had learned the mathematics of desperation. If she could somehow find $3,000 a month for the next 4 months, she might be able to negotiate a payment plan. If she could somehow find $7,000 by December, she could get them a 60-day extension, maybe negotiate the original debt. It was all if and maybe. The reality was simpler. She was going to lose her house. Maya was going to have to move in with David, who had remarried and had 2 young children with his new wife. The thought of her daughter living in that sterile, happy house full of the life David had chosen over them made Corinne want to scream. Instead, she opened her transcription software and began her work for the day, translating recorded medical dictations into typed reports. It was the kind of work that left her mind partially free to wander into darker territories. She was thinking about selling her kidney. That was the level she'd reached, considering black market organ sales. She'd read an article about it. You could get $40,000 for a kidney if you went through the right channels, the illegal channels. The illegal, dangerous channels. Corinne was so deep in this catastrophic spiral that she almost didn't hear the knock on the door. It was her neighbor, Patricia Hodges, president of the Willow Ridge HOA. Patricia was the kind of woman who looked like she'd been born wearing a polo shirt with a homeowners association logo embroidered on the chest. She had the smile of someone whose biggest life stressor was probably the color of her neighbor's door trim. "Corinne, hi," Patricia said, her voice carrying the synthetic brightness of someone who'd rehearsed compliments. I'm just doing a quick walkthrough of the neighborhood. You know how it is during inspection season. Just wanted to check in. Karen had made the mistake of opening the door without checking through the peephole first. Now she was trapped in the awkward territory between inviting Patricia inside, which she absolutely would not do, given the state of her kitchen and her will to live, and being rude. "Hi, Patricia, is everything okay?" Karen asked, keeping her body partially in the doorway, a physical barrier. "Oh yes, just a routine check. You know the rules. We need to make sure everyone's keeping up with their property maintenance." Patricia had already pivoted her body to look past Karen, toward the yard visible from the front door. Karen's stomach clenched. She'd been meaning to get to the landscaping. With everything else collapsing, things like lawn care had fallen through the cracks. The hedges had gotten leggy. There were weeds in the flower beds. It wasn't terrible, it wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't a HOA code. "We've had a few complaints about some of the properties on this street," Patricia continued, her smile never wavering. "Nothing about yours specifically, but we're just being proactive." Lies, she was definitely here about Karen's yard. "I'll get to it," Karen said. "I've just been busy." Of course, busy is the modern life, isn't it?" Patricia laughed, that tinkling, practiced laugh. "But let's say 2 weeks for the landscaping. We don't want to have to send a formal notice. You know the fees that come with those." Karen did know. She'd read the HOA charter after buying the house, one of those documents everyone signed without fully understanding. Violation fees started at $50 and escalated from there. For ongoing aesthetic violations, the fines could reach $500 a month. Karen had that money like she had a private jet. 2 weeks, Karen repeated, and the word felt like a small noose tightening around her neck. "Perfect, I knew you'd understand. The thing is, property values depend on everyone keeping their standards up. I'm sure you understand that better than anyone, given that you're trying to." Patricia trailed off, and Karen realized the woman was fishing. She wanted to know if Karen was in trouble. She wanted to know if the house might be going on the market. She was circling the way predators do. "I'll take care of it," Karen said flatly and began closing the door. "Wonderful, thank you so much. We just love having dedicated homeowners like you on the street." The door was closed before Patricia could finish her compliment. Karen leaned against the door, her heart hammering. She had 2 weeks to fix her yard. 2 weeks before HOA violations would start appearing on her record. The irony was exquisite. She was losing her house anyway, but she'd be damned if she was going to lose it while getting fined by a woman in a polo shirt who probably had a 7-figure net worth. She was still standing there, forehead against the doorframe, when her phone buzzed. It was an email notification. A research company based in Berkeley was looking for test subjects for a new renewable energy initiative. They were specifically looking for homeowners with outdoor space who wanted to participate in a community solar pilot program. The compensation was generous, $20,000 for a 1-year commitment. Karen almost deleted it. She deleted emails like this 3 times a week. Usually they were scams or MLMs or worse, but something made her click through. The program was real. It was a nonprofit initiative working with Stanford University. They were testing a new prototype for distributed renewable energy collection, essentially an advanced solar array system, but revolutionary. It involved underground infrastructure and specialized wiring that could harvest energy more efficiently than traditional rooftop solar. The pay was legitimate. The commitment was flexible, and if you read between the lines, they needed people desperately. The language about ideal candidates and immediate availability suggested they were behind schedule. Karen read through the entire description twice. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She opened a Word document and began drafting an application email. It was probably a waste of time, but everything was a waste of time now. Everything was time she didn't have. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Dr. Amelia Sinclair, and she had the kind of voice that made you sit up straighter even when she couldn't see you. Clipped, efficient, with the accent of someone educated at prestigious institutions. "I've reviewed your application," Dr. Sinclair said, "and I'm very interested in moving forward. Your property is ideally situated, good southern exposure, the right soil composition from what I can see on the satellite imagery. But I want to walk you through what we're actually proposing before we get into specifics." Karen was at her desk, a cup of actually hot coffee beside her. She'd made fresh coffee for this call, as if that might improve her odds. "I'm listening," Karen said. "What we've developed is a geothermal energy harvesting system that's fundamentally different from traditional solar," Dr. Sinclair explained. "Instead of panels on the roof, we install a network of underground conductors. The system harnesses the Earth's geothermal gradient, the temperature differential between the surface and deeper soil layers. Combined with sophisticated circuitry, it can generate a surprising amount of electricity." "How much is a surprising amount?" Karen asked. "For a residential installation with your property size, we're looking at approximately 15 to 20 kilowatt-hours per day. Most homes use between 20 and 30, so you'd be covering roughly 60 to 70% of your household electricity needs." Karen had gasped audibly. 70%. Her electric bill was running close to $300 a month, high because the house was old and poorly insulated, and she kept the thermostat higher than she should have because cold made her anxious. Cutting that down to $90, that was almost $4,000 a year. Over 5 years, that was enough to make a real difference. "There's a catch, though," Dr. Sinclair had said, and Karen heard it in her voice, the hesitation of someone about to ask for something that required careful explanation. "The installation requires burying the conductors in your yard. The system needs to be placed at specific depths and intervals. It's not invasive, but it does mean you'll have digging in your yard, and depending on your soil conditions, it might take a few weeks." "Will I be able to use my yard during installation?" "Partially. We'll work in sections and try to minimize disruption. Honestly, the whole process should take 3 to 4 weeks if everything goes smoothly. Then we'll have it properly landscaped, and you won't even know it's there." Karen had felt something shift inside her, a door opening that she thought was sealed shut. "And the $20,000, she asked, "what's that for?" "That's our commitment to test participants. It covers the installation cost, which would normally run about $60,000 retail, and provides an incentive for your participation. But the real value, Karen, is what happens after. You keep all the electricity you generate. You keep the energy credits. If you generate more than you use in a month, you can sell it back to the grid. Some of our pilot participants in California are making money." Karen's head was spinning. "When would you need to do this?" "As soon as possible. We're behind schedule with our pilot program, and I'll be honest, we're getting nervous about it. My superiors want results. I want results. If you're interested, I can have my installation team at your house in 10 days. We can have this wrapped up before the holidays." 10 days? In 10 days, her yard could be transformed into something that would make Patricia Hodges's eyes glaze over with boredom. No violations, no fines, no threat from the HOA. And $20,000. "I want to do this," Karen heard herself say. "I want to do it." She'd expected resistance. She'd expected legal documents and waiting periods and things to go wrong. Instead, Dr. Sinclair had been relieved, almost giddy. "Wonderful. I'll send over the contract and the initial technical specifications. We'll need to do a soil survey, but I can have a team at your place this Friday to assess. Once we get the data, we'll finalize the installation schedule." "Friday? That's only 3 days away." "We work fast," Dr. Sinclair had said, and there was something in her tone that was almost conspiratorial. "We believe in this project, Karen. We believe in what we're building, and I think you're going to be really happy with what we do for your property." After they'd hung up, Karen had sat in her office chair for a full 5 minutes without moving. She'd read through the contract 3 times. It was unusually simple for something involving her house. Surprisingly few restrictions, surprisingly generous terms. The only real requirement was that she not interfere with the system, not allow unauthorized people to access the installation, and not discuss the specific technical details of the system with neighbors. The contract had a section for confidentiality, but it was vague. It didn't forbid her from mentioning the program, just the technical specifics. It made sense. Competitors would be interested in their innovation. When Maya came home from her shift, Karen told her. $20,000, Maya had repeated as if she'd misheard. "Mom, that's..." "I know what it is," Karen said. "It's a buffer, it's a chance. We can catch up on the house, and there's still months of reduced electric bills after that." "But they're going to dig up the yard. That seems weird." "It's geothermal," Karen explained, using the language Dr. Sinclair had given her. "It's clean energy. They're testing a new system, and if it works, everyone benefits." Maya had hugged her, really hugged her, not the distracted half-hug of a tired teenager, but a full, genuine embrace. "Mom, I knew we'd be okay. I knew it." Corinne had held her daughter and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to believe that maybe they actually would be. The soil survey team arrived on Friday morning in a white van with Stanford logos on the side. There were 2 men and a woman, all in professional polo shirts, the word geothermal printed across the back, and they carried equipment that looked like something NASA might use. They spent 3 hours in Corinne's yard, taking measurements, running some kind of ground-penetrating radar device across different sections, driving small electrodes into the soil at precise intervals. They barely spoke to Corinne beyond confirming that she was the homeowner. They were focused, professional, and entirely absorbed in their work. By Friday evening, they'd left behind holes about the diameter of a pencil at 12 different spots across the yard. The woman, whose name tag read Sandra, had assured Corinne that they'd be filled in during the installation process. "Your soil composition is ideal," Sandra had said, somehow making this sound like a personal accomplishment. "We're very happy with this property." The installation was scheduled for the following Monday. Corinne spent the weekend anxious. She'd signed the contract, electronically with a digital signature that felt both final and insubstantial. The money would be deposited after the installation was complete and the system passed initial diagnostics. $20,000, 4 weeks of electric bills, a couple months of mortgage payments, a doorway to breathing room. She told no one but Maya. She didn't mention it to David when he texted about picking Maya up the following Friday. She especially didn't mention it to Patricia Hodges when she spotted the HOA president driving slowly past her house on Sunday morning. Monday arrived with overcast skies and the smell of impending rain. The installation crew showed up at 8 a.m. in 2 trucks with more equipment than Corinne would have thought necessary. There were 6 of them this time, plus Dr. Sinclair herself, who arrived in a Tesla and moved with the kind of purposeful energy that made everyone else seem sluggish by comparison. "Let's get started," Dr. Sinclair said, not bothering with pleasantries. She walked Corinne through the property, pointing to different zones marked with stakes and spray paint, the work of the survey team. "We're going to work section by section, starting with the eastern third. We'll need full access, and we'd prefer if you stay inside during the digging portions. The equipment is safe, but it's not designed for bystanders." By 9 a.m., the first excavator had arrived. It was larger than Corinne expected, a tract machine that required a trailer to transport. The crew began carefully digging trenches in the marked sections, removing sod in neat sections that they stacked at the perimeter. The operation had the precision of a military campaign. Corinne tried to work from her home office, but the sound of the machinery was impossible to ignore. Instead, she found herself watching from windows, tracking the progress. She'd never really thought about what was under her yard. It was just dirt, grass, the foundation of the surface where life happened. Now it was becoming a territory to be excavated and studied and transformed. By noon, they dug trenches about 3 feet deep in a grid pattern across the eastern section. Crew members were now laying down some kind of conductive cable, thick stuff, wrapped in protective casing, in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. Dr. Sinclair moved between positions, checking measurements, making adjustments, pointing out corrections to her team. At one point, Corinne noticed that Dr. Sinclair was staring at something on her tablet with an expression Corinne couldn't quite read. It looked like concern, but Dr. Sinclair switched it off quickly when she noticed Corinne watching from the kitchen window. By evening, the eastern third of the yard was transformed. The trenches were still open, but now they contained these elaborate networks of cable and what looked like small box-like units at precise intervals. The crew had left everything exposed. They'd return tomorrow to continue the installation. "It's coming together beautifully," Dr. Sinclair had told Corinne as the crew packed up. "We're a bit ahead of schedule, actually. If the weather holds, we might be completely finished by Friday." Friday, 3 days away. That night, Corinne tried to sleep, but found herself lying awake, listening to the wind, imagining the complicated infrastructure beneath her house. She kept thinking about how strange it was to have your own property become unfamiliar territory, to have excavators and strangers and cables and systems turning it into something other than home. Tuesday and Wednesday followed the same pattern. More digging, more cable laying, more of those mysterious box units being positioned. The crew worked efficiently, moving to the western section of the yard, then the northern section. By Wednesday evening, almost the entire yard had been transformed into a grid of open trenches containing elaborate systems that looked like something between an art installation and a weapons system. Corinne noticed that some neighbors had begun stopping by their fences, curious. She saw Patricia Hodges drive past twice, once very slowly, once with the HOA vice president. On Wednesday night, Corinne had a conversation with Maya that made her nervous. "What is all that stuff in the yard?" Maya had asked, coming home from work. "Geothermal energy system," Corinne explained. "It's going to generate most of our electricity." "It looks like a lot of something," Maya said carefully. "It's advanced technology," Corinne said. "Very new, that's part of why they're testing it." Maya had nodded, but she'd looked worried. Corinne recognized it as the expression Maya made when she was deciding whether to push on something or let it go. She'd let it go, but the fact that she'd asked meant she'd been noticing. Thursday morning, Patricia Hodges showed up at the door. "Corinne, hi," Patricia said, that smile in place but her eyes harder than usual. "I've gotten a couple of questions from neighbors about your property. There's a lot of activity, and I wondered if you might fill me in." Corinne had been prepared for this. Dr. Sinclair's contract had covered it. "Solar project," Corinne said. "Clean energy initiative from Stanford. Residential pilot program." Patricia's expression shifted, not entirely accepting, but softer. Solar was respectable. Solar was the kind of thing that fit the HOA's progressive-leaning aesthetic. "How long will it take?" Patricia asked. "Should be done by Friday," Corinne said. "And it won't be an issue for property maintenance standards once it's completed." "It's underground mostly," Corinne said. "They'll landscape it, you won't be able to tell it's there." Patricia had nodded, already mentally pivoting to the next neighborhood concern. "That sounds fine. I'll let the other residents know. You're actually quite forward-thinking, Corinne. This is exactly the kind of progressive initiative that makes Willow Ridge special." After Patricia left, Corinne had felt equal parts relieved and nauseated. She'd lied. Not technically, there was solar equipment involved. But she'd lied through omission, presenting a version of the truth that had created an entirely different image than what was actually happening in her yard. It hadn't felt good, but it also hadn't stopped her from what was happening. Friday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. The installation crew, now numbering 7, worked with intense focus. Corinne watched as they began closing the trenches, carefully covering the cable systems with soil, using some kind of marker flag system to indicate where everything was buried. By 2 p.m., the last trench had been covered. By 3 p.m., the crew had begun the landscaping work, seeding new grass, replanting sod, positioning river rocks in a pattern that made it look intentional, decorative even. By 5 p.m., the yard looked almost normal. Almost. There was an artificial quality to it, like a stage set of a yard rather than an actual yard, but someone just glancing at it would see grass and landscaping. Dr. Sinclair walked Corinne through the final system. "The main control box is in your basement," she said, leading Corinne downstairs. They'd installed a metal cabinet alongside her electric panel, sleek, modern, covered in displays and buttons. "This monitors the entire system. It collects data about generation, consumption, and efficiency. There's an app. I'll send you the login information where you can track everything from your phone." "When do I start saving on my electric bill?" Corinne asked. "Immediately. The system is generating now, feeding directly into your home's electrical infrastructure. As of this moment, your utility bill is being reduced by the amount of power we're generating. By the end of the month, you should see it in your utility statement." Corinne stared at the cabinet. It was real. It was actually happening. "One thing," Dr. Sinclair said, and there was that hesitation again. "The system is proprietary. I know the contract mentioned this, but I want to emphasize it in person. If anyone asks you about how it works, the technical details, the infrastructure, we need to keep that confidential. It's not just about protecting our intellectual property. It's about the integrity of the pilot program." "I understand," Corinne said. "Good," Dr. Sinclair said. She smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm smile Corinne had seen from her. "I think you're going to be very happy with this, Corinne. I think this is going to change things for you." After Dr. Sinclair and her crew had left, Corinne stood in her basement, staring at the cabinet. The displays glowed softly in the dim light. One screen showed a real-time readout. Current generation, 2.3 kW current consumption, 1.8 kW surplus, 0.5 kW. They were generating more power than they were using. For exactly 17 days, Corinne Mitchell experienced something close to joy. The first utility bill came on the 22nd, and it showed a 50% reduction from the previous month. Instead of nearly $300, she was being charged less than $150. By the second month, after the system had optimized and the weather remained favorable, it dropped further, down to $85. The second payment came electronically, as promised, $20,000 deposited directly into her checking account. Corinne had sat in front of her computer for 2 hours, just staring at the balance. She transferred it to her mortgage lender with shaking hands. 5 months of payments in one go. When the bank had received the payment, they'd sent her a letter expressing renewed confidence in your commitment to meeting your obligations and removing the foreclosure timeline. She wasn't going to lose her house. The relief was so profound it had made her physically ill for a day. The kind of stress release that manifests as a fever and chills before it breaks and leaves you hollowed out and clean. She'd paid bills she'd been letting slide. She'd put food back in the fridge. She'd bought Meyer a gift certificate for clothes, not used but new to her from Goodwill like they'd been doing for the past year. She'd filled the gas tank of her car without checking the price first. Small freedoms that most people took for granted had become luxuries. The yard was thriving. Whatever the installation crew had done beyond just the technical system, they'd done it well. The grass had come in thick and green. The landscaping rocks looked intentional and attractive. If anything, the yard was more beautiful than it had been in years. She'd had exactly one neighbor inquiry, a man on the western fence who'd asked what she'd done. "Solar project," she'd said, using the same half-truthful explanation. "Looks good," he'd said. "Environmentally conscious, I respect that." Patricia Hodges had sent a note in the weekly HOA newsletter commending innovative property improvements and mentioning that Willow Ridge was proud to host responsible homeowners implementing renewable energy solutions. Corinne suspected Patricia's enthusiasm was partly motivated by the fact that an HOA president with a community member implementing clean energy in her district looked good to the Homeowners Association board. Maya had relaxed. Corinne could see it in the way her daughter moved through the house, the way she stopped checking the kitchen cabinets to see what was available for dinner. The baseline anxiety that had been hovering over both of them for months had lifted slightly. They'd even started talking about college again. Meyer had gotten acceptance letters from 2 state schools, and now that the house wasn't about to be repossessed, they could actually make plans instead of just hopping. Corinne had returned to her transcription work with renewed focus. She'd picked up 3 new clients. The work that had felt like drowning before now felt like steady income, still not a fortune but meaningful. She'd even done something radical. She'd allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the next month. It was during the 3rd week of this bubble of relief that she noticed the first strange thing. She'd been working in her home office when she'd heard a humming sound, not the ordinary hum of her home electronics. This was different. It was coming from below, a low-frequency vibration that made her teeth ache slightly. She'd gone to the basement and checked the system cabinet, but everything looked normal. The displays showed optimal operation. She'd gone back upstairs and tried to ignore it. The humming had intensified the next day. It was more pronounced in the morning and evening, and it seemed to vary in pitch. Corinne had checked the system app multiple times, but everything appeared normal. Generation rates were high. Consumption was steady. She'd mentioned it casually to Maya, who dismissed it as normal house sounds. But Corinne knew her house. She'd lived in it for nearly 3 decades. She knew every settling creak, every pipe rattle, every sound that the structure made as it weathered time and temperature. This was different. This was new. She'd considered calling Dr. Sinclair, but found herself reluctant to do so. She didn't want to seem like a difficult client, someone who noticed problems, someone who asked questions. The contract had been clear about confidentiality and avoiding unnecessary contact. Besides, everything was working fine. The bills were low. The yard was beautiful. What did it matter if there was an occasional humming sound? It was around the same time that she noticed the birds. They disappeared from the yard. Corinne had always had a modest ecosystem in her garden, nothing fancy, just the ordinary suburban birds. Robins, sparrows, finches. She'd had a feeder that David had installed years ago, and she kept it stocked somewhat haphazardly. But over the past 2 weeks, the birds had stopped coming. The feeder was full of untouched seed. The yard was silent in a way that felt almost unnatural. She mentioned this to Maya almost as an afterthought. "Birds leaving is weird," Maya had said, and then, "Mom, do you think it's the system? Like electromagnetic radiation or something?" "The system is clean energy," Corinne had said, but the conviction had wavered slightly. "It's not like that." Except she didn't really know what it was like. She'd read the materials Dr. Sinclair had provided, glossy, professional documents with diagrams and technical specifications that were, on closer inspection, vague. They described the function and the results, but not the actual mechanism. There were a lot of words like proprietary technology and patent pending. Corinne had found herself spending time on her laptop, searching for information about geothermal systems. What she found was complex and mostly about traditional geothermal heating and cooling, which worked on an entirely different principle. The kind of system that supposedly was in her yard, ground-based energy harvesting, had limited information available online. There were a few research papers, mostly from Stanford and a few from Berkeley, but they were heavy on speculation and light on practical results. One paper, from a researcher named Dr. Chen at Berkeley, mentioned concerns about unintended environmental effects in test installations, but the details had been redacted in the publicly available version. Corinne had stared at those redacted sections, trying to read between the black bars like she might develop X-ray vision through sheer determination. She'd talked herself out of it. Some part of her didn't want to know if there was something wrong. If there was something wrong, then she might have to do something about it. And if she had to do something about it, she might lose the system. And if she lost the system, she'd have to pay back the $20,000. It wasn't in the contract that she could keep it if the system failed, and if she had to pay it back. The house would be gone within 3 months. So she decided not to investigate further. She decided to let the humming be harmless. She decided to accept that birds sometimes moved on. It was a decision that would echo through everything that happened after. The letter from the city came on a Tuesday in November. Corinne had opened it expecting it to be something routine, a water utility notice or a street maintenance update. Instead, it was from the Department of Environmental Health and Safety. "Dear Ms. Mitchell," it began with the bureaucratic formality that usually preceded nothing good. "We have received a complaint regarding potential environmental hazards on your residential property located at 447 Willow Ridge Drive. Specifically, the complaint references unusual electromagnetic activity and potential soil contamination. We would like to schedule an inspection of your property. Please contact us within 5 business days to arrange a time." Corinne had read the letter 3 times. Each time hopping the words would change and mean something different. Unusual electromagnetic activity, potential soil contamination, complaint. Who had filed a complaint? Had Patricia Hodges suspected something? Had one of the neighbors noticed something was wrong? Her hands had shaken as she'd called the number on the letterhead. She'd reached a clerk named Robert who'd seemed entirely uninterested in urgency. He'd scheduled an inspection for Friday, 4 days away. After hanging up, Corinne had immediately called Dr. Sinclair. The call had gone to voicemail. She'd left a message, trying to keep her voice steady, explaining that the city had scheduled an inspection. She'd asked Dr. Sinclair to call her back as soon as possible. Dr. Sinclair hadn't called back that day, or the next. By Thursday, Corinne had called her number 6 times. The 7th call had been answered by someone else, a man with a formal voice who'd said that Dr. Sinclair was currently unavailable and that he'd pass along the message. The Friday inspection had started at 9 a.m. The environmental inspector, a woman named Susan Chen who seemed tired and carried an equipment case that looked older than Corinne, had arrived in an unmarked sedan. "So you had a geothermal installation recently?" Susan had asked, not even bothering with pleasantries. "Yes, about a month ago. Stanford-based research project, Clean Energy Initiative." Susan had made a note. "And you have documentation for this installation, names of the company, personnel, any contracts or paperwork." Corinne had provided everything. Susan had photographed each document with a professional camera, then handed the originals back. "Let me do some readings," Susan had said. For the next hour, Susan had worked methodically through the house and yard with equipment Corinne didn't recognize. She'd taken measurements at various points. She'd used a device that looked like an oversized Geiger counter, but wasn't. She'd taken soil samples from multiple points in the yard, carefully documenting each location and sealing samples in sterile containers. Through it all, Susan had barely spoken, just made notes on a clipboard and maintained an expression that was professionally neutral but concerning in its intensity. Finally, standing in Corinne's kitchen, Susan had looked up from her notes. "I'm going to be direct," Susan had said. "What do you know about this system, the actual technical function?" "It's geothermal energy harvesting," Corinne had said, which was accurate. "It generates electricity by harvesting the Earth's thermal energy." "Right, that's the sales pitch." Susan had closed her notebook. "And you signed a confidentiality agreement regarding the technical details." Corinne's stomach had dropped. "How did you?" "Because we've had 3 other installations of the same system in the area, and all 3 of them have had complaints. 2 reported similar symptoms to what you've described: electromagnetic humming, wildlife disappearance. 1 homeowner reported illness." Illness? Corinne had sat down heavily. Headaches, nausea, sleep disturbance. All reported it started after the installation. Susan had taken off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "Here's what I can tell you. That system is not a standard geothermal installation. What's buried in your yard appears to be generating an electromagnetic field that's significantly above normal environmental baseline. The preliminary soil samples show elevated levels of exotic minerals and synthetic compounds that are inconsistent with natural soil." Corinne had felt the ground tilting under her feet. "Are they safe? Should I be concerned?" "That's what I need to determine. I've contacted Stanford. Officially, they say the project doesn't exist. No record of Dr. Amelia Sinclair in their directory. No registered research project for geothermal energy harvesting. Nothing." The room had started spinning. "What do you mean there's no project?" "I mean whatever's in your yard, it's not an official Stanford research initiative. I have a meeting with the Dean of Environmental Sciences on Monday. Until then, I'd recommend limiting time in your yard." "Can you remove it?" Corinne had asked. "Not yet. We need to fully understand what we're dealing with first. But I want to be clear. This is now under official investigation. You may be contacted for legal proceedings depending on what we find." After Susan had left, Corinne had stood in her kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. She'd tried Dr. Sinclair's number again. This time the call went to a disconnected number message. She'd searched online for Dr. Amelia Sinclair. What she'd found was a woman who existed in academic papers from 12 years ago, all on renewable energy, but nothing current. No recent publications, no current affiliation, no social media. She'd searched for the installation company. The website they'd used was no longer active. The phone number was disconnected. They'd disappeared. The entire operation had been as real as fog, and now it had dissolved. Corinne had sat on her kitchen floor and cried with a ferocity that surprised her. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that, but from rage. From the specific rage that comes from realizing you've been manipulated, that while you were desperate, someone had seen that desperation and used it like a tool. Maya had come home from work to find her mother still on the kitchen floor. "Mom, what happened?" And Corinne had had to tell her daughter that the salvation she'd felt just weeks ago was built on a foundation of lies. By Monday morning, the news was everywhere. Corinne had woken to find her phone filling with notifications. Local news outlets had picked up the story. Mysterious geothermal installation Spark City investigation. SDANFORD-affiliated scientist missing. Local RESIDNTS unknowingly part of undisclosed experiment. The investigation had accelerated over the weekend. Susan Chen's meeting with the Dean of Environmental Sciences had led to a broader inquiry. It turned out that the 3 other installations in the area had all been part of something called Project Cascade, which had absolutely no official backing from any university and had been funded through a series of deliberately obscured accounts. Dr. Amelia Sinclair, it turned out, did exist, but she didn't work for Stanford. She worked for a private research firm called Verdant Technology Solutions, which also had no legitimate online presence until the news started digging and discovered they'd been operating out of a small office in Los Altos under a shell corporation. The story that emerged was stranger than Karen could have imagined. Verdant Technology Solutions had been founded by a researcher named Marcus Hendricks, who'd spent years in official research environments before becoming convinced that governmental regulations and institutional oversight were preventing him from pursuing revolutionary technologies. He decided to conduct experiments outside official channels, testing next-generation energy harvesting systems in residential installations without approval or oversight. Dr. Sinclair hadn't been a con artist, not exactly. She believed in the technology, but she'd also been willing to operate in legal gray areas because she was convinced that what they were developing would revolutionize energy production. The installations, the news reported, had been generating electromagnetic fields that exceeded safe exposure levels according to EPA guidelines. The soil had been loaded with conductive compounds designed to optimize the energy harvesting, but these compounds hadn't been evaluated for long-term environmental impact or soil stability. And the energy the systems generated hadn't actually been feeding into the residents' homes. It had been transmitted wirelessly to a central collection point where it was being stored and studied. The money the residents had received, the $20,000 and the reduced utility bills, that had been payment not to ask questions. It had been compensation for being part of a secret experiment. By Tuesday morning, federal investigators had gotten involved. Project Cascade was being classified as potential fraud and environmental contamination. The residents of all 4 installations were being contacted about remediation and legal proceedings. Karen had received an official letter from the EPA by Wednesday. Ms. Mitchell, your property is now classified as a potential environmental hazard zone. Pending analysis, we are recommending immediate removal of all Project Cascade infrastructure. We have engaged Licensed Environmental Remediation, LLC, to evaluate your specific situation and determine the appropriate course of action. They wanted to dig up her yard. They wanted to remove everything. The timeline was as soon as possible, which turned out to mean Saturday morning. The news vans had arrived on Thursday. A reporter named Jessica Walsh, working for a Bay Area news affiliate, had somehow gotten Karen's address and showed up with a camera crew. Karen had made the mistake of opening the door. Ms. Mitchell, can you tell us how you felt when you discovered you'd been unknowingly part of an unauthorized experiment? Jessica had asked, thrusting a microphone toward Karen's face. I didn't know, Karen had said, the only thing she could manage. Are you aware that the electromagnetic field levels measured at your property exceeded EPA safety guidelines by approximately 30%? No, I wasn't aware of that. How long were you exposed to these potentially harmful radiation levels? Karen had slammed the door. By Friday evening, her street had become something out of a dystopian novel. News vans lined the curb. Photographers crouched behind bushes. A crowd of curious neighbors gathered across the street, watching. Patricia Hodges was being interviewed by a reporter, explaining that the HOA had full confidence that the city will address this matter properly, and that we maintain strict standards for all residences in Willow Ridge. Maya had refused to leave her room. She'd taken it as a personal betrayal, which, on some level, it was. Karen had been so desperate to solve their problems that she'd agreed to something without understanding it, and now they were public property, their medical and financial vulnerability on display for news entertainment. The worst part had come Friday evening when David had arrived. He'd gotten a call from his lawyer about potential liability. Karen's financial problems were now threatening to become his financial problems through spousal connection, even though they were divorced. Jesus Christ, Karen, he'd said, standing in her living room in front of the news vans visible through the window. You let a random company bury God knows what in your yard and you didn't even ask questions. I was trying not to lose the house, Karen had said quietly. I was trying not to fail at keeping a roof over Maya's head. And now you've exposed Maya to potentially carcinogenic radiation. How is that better? The words had hit like a physical blow because they were true. In her desperation, she'd made a choice that had put her daughter in danger. Not intentionally, but intentions didn't matter much when results were what counted. Saturday morning at 7 a.m., the remediation crew had arrived. They'd been equipped like a hazmat team, protective suits, equipment, carefully sealed containers for anything they removed. They'd started immediately, carefully digging up the installed system, documenting everything, sealing samples. Karen had watched from the house, unable to look away. The beautiful yard that she'd been so proud of, the yard that had looked like hope, was being systematically excavated and treated like toxic waste. By 2 p.m., they'd removed everything. The yard was a wasteland of torn sod and exposed earth, marked with warning flags. The crew had taken soil samples, filled their containers, and packed up with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. "We'll need to do some testing," the crew leader had told Karen. "Most likely, you'll need a soil remediation treatment. We're looking at replacing the top 18 inches of soil and potentially running ionization treatments to neutralize any residual compounds." "How long will that take?" Karen had asked. 3 to 4 weeks, and it's going to cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000. The irony had been so precise it hurt. $15,000 to $20,000, the exact amount she'd received as compensation for participating in the experiment. It was like the universe was billing her for her own naivete. "Will insurance cover it?" Karen had asked without hope. "That depends on your policy," the crew leader had said. "But most homeowners' insurance doesn't cover damage from unauthorized experiments. You might have a claim against Verdant Technology Solutions or the individual researchers, but that's a civil matter." After they left, Karen had stood in her yard, or what was left of it, and stared at the scarred earth. The ground looked wounded. It looked like something had been torn from it and left it hollowed out. Her phone had buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Ms. Mitchell, this is attorney Richard Chen with Chen and Associates. We are initiating a class action lawsuit against Verdant Technology Solutions and Dr. Amelia Sinclair on behalf of all Project Cascade participants. If you would like to join, please respond to this message." The next 2 weeks were a blurred nightmare of legal meetings, depositions, and media coverage that refused to die. Karen had hired a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Morrison who specialized in environmental liability at a cost Karen couldn't afford. Sarah had been clear about her assessment. Karen had a strong case against Verdant Technology Solutions, but the company was hemorrhaging money and might not have funds to pay a settlement. She might recover something. She might recover nothing. It would take years to find out. "There's also the question of whether you signed away your right to sue," Sarah had said, reviewing the contract Karen had signed with such little scrutiny. The contract had a clause about indemnification, a legal term that basically meant Karen agreed not to hold them responsible for anything. It was breathtaking in its scope. Almost anything that happened, Karen would be legally prohibited from seeking compensation for. "It might hold up," Sarah had said. "It might not. Courts are increasingly skeptical of these kinds of broad waivers, especially when there's evidence of fraud or intentional harm. But the other side will argue that you should have read the contract more carefully." And that had been the thing that kept Karen up at night. She should have read it more carefully. She should have asked more questions. She should have been more skeptical, more careful, more something. The remediation work on her yard had begun the following week. It was disturbing work to watch. A crew removing the damaged top layer of soil, treating the remaining earth with chemical compounds designed to neutralize whatever exotic minerals Verdant had buried in her land, then replacing everything with clean topsoil and re-establishing landscaping. By the time it was done by late November, the yard looked normal again, maybe even better. The new sod was pristine, the soil was clean, there were no traces of the system left. But Karen knew what was underneath. The knowledge didn't go away just because you couldn't see it. The news had eventually moved on to other stories. Verdant Technology Solutions had shut down operations. Dr. Amelia Sinclair had disappeared, possibly fled the country, possibly hiding somewhere. Marcus Hendricks, the founder, had been arrested and was facing federal charges. The 4 residents of Project Cascade Installations had received settlement offers from Verdant's insurance company. Karen's was for $12,000, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement that forbade her from speaking publicly about what had happened. She'd stared at that check for a day before depositing it. $12,000, less than what it had cost to fix the yard, less than what it had cost to clean up the mess left behind. But it was something. The money had gone towards soil remediation costs and lawyer fees, with a few thousand left over. It wasn't enough to get ahead on the mortgage, but it was enough to stay current. Enough to avoid another foreclosure threat, at least for a while. Maya had recovered faster than Karen. By mid-November, she'd accepted that her school had briefly been newsworthy and was now tired of the attention. The reporters had moved on. The neighborhood had stopped starring. Life had begun its normalization process. But something had broken between Karen and her daughter. Nothing dramatic. Maya still came home, still did her schoolwork, still went to work. But there was distance now, a wariness, an understanding that her mother, despite the best intentions, could make choices that put them both in jeopardy. It was the middle of December when Karen received an unexpected phone call. "Ms. Mitchell, this is Dr. Susan Chen, the environmental inspector who assessed your property." "Hi," Karen had said, unsure why Susan was calling. "I wanted to reach out because I've been following the investigation into Verdant Technology Solutions, and something's come up that I thought you should know about." Susan had paused. "We found Dr. Amelia Sinclair." Karen had felt her chest tighten. "Where?" "She turned herself in yesterday morning. She's been arrested and is cooperating with federal investigators. But more importantly, and this is the thing I thought you'd want to know, she wanted me to tell you something." "What?" Karen had asked. "She said to tell you that you shouldn't blame yourself for believing her. That she knew how desperation worked, and she'd used it, and that haunted her more than she expected it would." Karen had sat with that information, not sure how to process it. "She also said," Susan had continued, "that the technology actually does work, that the energy generation was real, the efficiency improvements were real, even if the method of testing and implementation was entirely unethical and illegal. She said that what she was trying to do eventually, if it had been done properly, would have helped people like you, people who needed it." "But it wasn't done properly," Karen had said. "No," Susan had agreed, "it wasn't." After hanging up, Karen had gone outside to look at her yard. The winter weather had set in, and the grass was dormant, brown. The landscape looked like it was sleeping, waiting for spring. She'd thought about what Dr. Sinclair had said, about the technology working, about the intention being good even if the execution had been monstrous, and she'd wondered if that distinction mattered at all. If intentions meant anything when the results were damage and violation, and a yard that would never quite feel like hers again. Part 8, The Turning Point. By January, the news had completely died. The trial of Marcus Hendricks was scheduled for spring, but without daily updates, the public had moved on to new outrages and scandals. Karen had settled into a new baseline. The house wasn't being foreclosed, but she wasn't recovering financially. The remediation costs and legal fees had consumed the settlement money. She was back to operating month to month, but at least month to month didn't involve imminent loss anymore. Her work had picked up slightly. One of her previous medical transcription clients had recommended her to a colleague, and she'd picked up 2 new clients. It wasn't going to transform her circumstances, but it would make a difference over time. She'd learned something from the Project Cascade disaster, though she wasn't sure if it was a useful learning or just a scar. She'd learned that the offer that seems too good to be true usually is. She'd learned that desperation can override your judgment, and that acknowledging this about yourself was important. She'd also learned that the systems that put people into desperation, the foreclosure systems, the gig economy job market, the way medical debt could destroy lives, those systems were designed to make people vulnerable to precisely the kind of offer that Verdant Technology had made. Which meant that somewhere someone else was going to be in her position, desperate, struggling, willing to take a risk that seems unwise because the alternative is losing everything. She'd thought about calling Susan Chen about that, about whether there was any way to warn people, to help them not make the same choice. But the non-disclosure agreement prevented her from talking about what had happened. The agreement was surprisingly comprehensive in its restrictions. She couldn't tell neighbors. She couldn't post on social media. She couldn't discuss it with anyone except her lawyer and immediate family. She couldn't even post about general geothermal energy systems because the language was vague enough that she could be accused of violating it. In exchange for her silence, she got $12,000 and the ability to close this chapter. It was the bargain society had offered her. Keep quiet and get paid a fraction of what you lost. It was January 15th when Patricia Hodges showed up at the door. Karen had almost not opened it. She'd seen the polo shirt through the peephole and had considered pretending she wasn't home. But Maya was upstairs, and Patricia had probably seen Karen's car, and avoiding her forever wasn't realistic. Karen, hi, Patricia had said, that smile in place. I wanted to check in. I haven't seen you in the neighborhood much lately, and I was concerned. Karen had not believed that for a second. I've been working mostly from home, Karen had said. Of course, of course. Well, I wanted to let you know that the HOA has approved your remediation work on the yard. It looks beautiful, by the way, really professional. We appreciate you handling the situation so promptly. What Patricia meant was, thank you for making my job easier by not leaving an environmental disaster sitting in your yard for the world to see. Thank you, Karen had said. Also, I wanted to mention, and this is just neighborly advice, not official HOA business, but if you ever have any other contractors or services coming to your house, you should get approval first. Some of the neighbors have been asking me if we have a process for that, given the recent situation, and I think we should probably have one. Patricia wasn't being threatening exactly, but the message was clear. Any future activity on Karen's property would be scrutinized. Any future decisions would be questioned. Karen had nodded and closed the door after Patricia left. She'd stood in her entryway for a long time, thinking about how fragile safety really was. How quickly you could go from being a responsible homeowner to being the neighborhood cautionary tale. How one bad decision, even a bad decision made under duress, made while desperate, could mark you permanently in a community. That evening, Maya had come home from school in a better mood than she'd been in weeks. She'd gotten accepted to a second university, the one that had been her reach school. Full scholarship based on merit. Mom, Maya had said, showing her the email. I got in, I'm getting out. And Karen had heard the subtext. She was getting away from this neighborhood, this house, this reminder of her mother's desperation and poor choices. I'm so proud of you, Karen had said, and she'd meant it completely. Are you going to be okay? Maya had asked, and there had been real concern in the question. Like with the house and everything, if I'm at school. I'm going to be fine, Karen had said. You go have an amazing college experience, you learn everything, you build the life you want to build. After Maya had gone to her room to process her excitement, Karen had sat in the kitchen and allowed herself something she hadn't felt in a long time, cautious optimism. It wasn't that everything was fixed. The house was still precarious. The finances were still tight. The yard still carried the memory of what had been buried in it. But there was a trajectory now. A sense that time was moving forward, that recovery was possible. Maya would graduate and go to university and have opportunities that Karen never had. And Karen would find a way to keep the house, to stabilize her situation. It would take time. It might take years, but it was possible. In early February, Karen had made a decision. She drafted a letter to the CEO of Verdant Technology Solutions, delivered through Susan Chen, who had become something like a friend through the investigation process. In the letter, Karen had written, I'm writing to tell you that I hope that whatever your intentions were, you learned something about the responsibility that comes with having power over people in desperate situations. I was vulnerable. I was drowning. And you threw me a rope that turned out to be an anchor. I want you to understand what that cost me, not just financially, but psychologically. I want you to understand that the people you chose to experiment on were real people with real lives and real consequences for your choices. But I also want you to know that I survived this. I'm going to be okay. My daughter is going to have a future. And that, despite everything, is going to be because I learned to be more careful, more skeptical, and more strategic about my own survival. I hope that's not lost on you. She'd sent it without expectation that it would matter or even be delivered, but the act of writing it had been clarifying. By March, the remediation work on her yard was completely finished. The grass had turned green as the spring weather arrived. The yard looked fully normal, no traces of the system, no traces of the experiment, just a yard, just the ordinary suburban landscape where life happened. Karen had taken Maya out to the yard on a Saturday afternoon in late March, right before Maya left for her first semester of university. Remember when the birds disappeared? Maya had asked, looking around. Yeah, Karen had said. They're back, Maya had pointed to a robin on the fence. I saw a whole family of them this morning. Karen had watched the robin and she'd felt something settle in her chest. Maybe recovery wasn't about going back to where you started. Maybe it was about recognizing that you'd survived something, learned something, and were going to be different going forward. Maybe that was the goal. You're going to do amazing things, Karen had said, pulling her daughter close. "So will you," Maya had replied. And for the first time in over a year, Karen had believed it might be true. The local news station did a follow-up piece in November, 2 years after the Project Cascade story had broken. Karen had been asked to participate but had declined, citing the non-disclosure agreement. She hadn't wanted to be part of the media cycle again. But she'd watched the piece. It had covered the trial verdict. Marcus Hendricks had been convicted on fraud charges and was serving a 3-year federal sentence. Dr. Amelia Sinclair had cut a plea deal, cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges, and was serving probation with community service. Verdant Technology Solutions had been shut down permanently, its assets seized to pay settlements. The 4 residents of Project Cascade installations had received a class action settlement. Small amounts in the end, after legal fees were deducted, but something. Karen's portion of the settlement had been $5,300. After her lawyer had taken their cut, she'd received just under $3,800. The settlement check had arrived in October. She'd stared at it for a day, then deposited it into a college fund she'd opened for Maya. By late 2027, Karen's circumstances had stabilized into something manageable. She'd picked up more transcription clients over 2 years and had even started freelancing for a medical publishing company, work that paid better and offered the possibility of long-term contracts. She was no longer living month to month. She was living quarter to quarter, which felt luxurious by comparison. The yard had become beautiful. She'd started a garden, not for survival, but for pleasure. There were tomatoes and herbs and flowers. The birds had never returned in great numbers, but they came occasionally. Karen didn't know if there was a connection to the system that had been buried there, or if it was just the normal rhythm of suburban wildlife. She'd learned not to assume she understood the reasons things happened the way they did. Maya had thrived in college. She was studying environmental science with a focus on clean energy innovation. Karen had wondered when she'd seen Maya's major if the Project Cascade disaster had influenced the choice. She hadn't asked. Some things were better left unexamined. On the afternoon that the 2-year anniversary of the remediation came around, Karen had walked into her yard and stood on the grass, just feeling the ground beneath her feet. She'd been thinking a lot lately about the nature of trust and desperation, about the ways that systems exploit vulnerability, and about how you moved forward after you'd learned that the world was less safe than you'd assumed. She'd been thinking about Karen from 2 years ago, buried in eviction notices and medical debt, so ready to believe that salvation could come in the form of a Stanford research project, and a woman who seemed to understand exactly what she needed to hear. She'd learned that salvation is slower than desperation, that recovery doesn't come in bursts but in increments, that the world is full of people who will exploit your desperation, but it's also full of people, like Susan Chen, like Sarah Morrison, like the colleagues who'd recommended her for new work, who will help you climb back up. She'd learned that gardens grow slowly, and that sometimes that's the whole point. As she stood in her yard that afternoon, the sun moving through the sky the way it had moved through thousands of afternoons before and thousands that would come after, Karen Mitchell finally felt like she'd stopped running and started living. The light was golden, the grass was green, and the only things buried in her yard now were the roots of things growing toward the sun.